everybody who is on. I did put a little message in the chat welcoming you all, and thank you for letting me turn off your video and to stay on mute. But if you would like to ask your own question at the Q&A, just send us a message in the chat. Otherwise, Vicki and I'll ask questions for you on your behalf. Just gonna check email quick.
Perfect. We're all set on YouTube.
Good.
There we go. Uh-oh. Oh, darn, I didn't get the Zoom link. Uh-oh, hold on. Oh, goodness. There we go. Nope. I need to. Ugh. I'm just gonna, can I shrink this down for a second, Vicki?
Sure.
No, I'd have to exit it, right?
Who do you need to see?
Oh, I found it. I just got to send this to Donna, our Donna. There we go.
Perfect. Let me know when you're ready to start record.
Good. Awesome. Okay, I think we can start. That's great. I'm just going to get rid of that one video. All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to be here with you this evening at Rideau Lakes Public Library and for our wonderful author talk with Dr. Shelley Ball. We do have a little bit of housekeeping. We've put you all on stop video and we've asked you to be on mute. And if you have any issues with your computer, you need a little help, you can just send me a text, 803-7812. If not, at the Q&A, you can send your questions through and Vicki and I can ask the questions for you on your behalf. But if you would like to ask your own question, feel free. You can just send us a quick message in the chat and we'll let you have the floor. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Shelley Ball. Dr. Shelley Ball is a biologist with a PhD in evolutionary ecology and population genetics. She does not claim herself as a medical doctor. She has worked as a research scientist and a university professor. Shelley runs her own environmental education organization called Biosphere Environmental Education, where she specializes in youth environmental leadership expeditions and also mentors youth. She has also been a speaker on the TEDx. In 2016, she was part of the inaugural Homeward Bound Women in Science Leadership Expedition to Antarctica. Oh, we look forward to hearing about that. And Shelley is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and describes herself as a biologist, an educator, a photographer, a writer, and a storyteller. Shelley is a vocal advocate for the environment, women in science, and for human rights, having participated in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women twice. Shelley lives in 15 forested acres near Westport, Ontario. We welcome you, Shelley, and thank you so much for taking your time to do this for us, for our area.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lorelei. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about my my new book, and and hopefully share some information that will help other people. Obviously, we're wanting to get the word out about my book, but ultimately, this is focused on helping other people and helping them sort of navigate our new issue with ticks and Lyme disease. But at the same time, we live in a beautiful area and we shouldn't be hiding inside. So it's really about how we can get outside and enjoy nature and the outdoors safely. So thanks very much for having me. So I thought I would start by just really quickly going over what I'm going to cover tonight. And some of these things I'll go through fairly quickly, others I'll spend a little bit more time on. It's hard to kind of summarize an entire book, in kind of 40-45 minutes, but I really did want to sort of focus on some key information. So I'll start by talking just a little bit about my own journey with Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The first chapter of the book describes my story in detail. I just wanted to share a little bit about it because I think, those who may be dealing with Lyme disease or other tick-borne illnesses, may well sort of recognize their own story. Sadly, there are many of us going through it, and certainly I have heard other people's stories and thought, wow, that sounds all too familiar. So I'll just go through that really quickly, talk about what kind of the basics of ticks and Lyme disease, and what is Lyme disease, and how do we get it. Spend a little bit more time on a really important topic, is where do ticks live and how do we avoid them? I think that's one of the most important factors here. And one of the important messages I want to get across is, as I say, getting outside to still enjoy nature, but how do we do it while we mitigate the risk? How can we reduce the chance of a tick bite, to keep ourselves safe? And the good news is that there's lots that we can do, and some really great new habits that we can employ. I'll talk about, what happens if we are bitten by a tick, what sort of happens and what's the risk of getting Lyme disease, and then talk a little bit about diagnosis and also co-infections, meaning other microbes, other illnesses that we can get from a tick bite. A lot of people don't realize that when a tick around here bites us, that it's not just Lyme disease that we're at risk of getting it. And then I'm going to finish by talking about how do we treat Lyme disease, but I'm keeping that part very, very short. And even in the book, I don't go into a lot of detail because there are a lot of really excellent books out there that have been written about how to treat Lyme disease. And it's pretty complex. There's a lot of options, but what I want to do is just kind of give an overview of kind of the general approach, and not, sort of be prescriptive or go into details, but just to kind of give people an idea of, what are the options and how do we go find help. And then I'll just finish by kind of emphasizing some of the key take-home issues. I to emphasize, though, that I am not a medical doctor. I have a PhD in biology. I was a research scientist and university professor. So I, because of the skills and the knowledge I have and the experience, I'm able to read the peer-reviewed science literature out there on Lyme disease, even though I'm not a Lyme expert. And so what I'm conveying this evening is very much my own personal experience, my personal views based on that experience. And so I just want to make it really clear that I'm not a medical doctor. I am not, nothing tonight should be perceived as medical advice. And that, this presentation really is about my personal experience, and that neither I or, the library, Firefly Books, or anybody associated with the book is in any way liable how you use the information. And I think that's really important just to emphasize to folks, consult a physician or a health professional. And don't ever delay seeking medical treatment. We've got wonderful internet, but it's not a way to self-diagnose. It's a way to educate and obtain information. So, so I just want to emphasize that. I just wanted to as I was putting together the presentation, I thought I would just really quickly sort of go over a few terms that you're going to hear me use tonight. I know this is a little bit dry, but I just want to make sure that, we're kind of on the same page in terms of how I'm using terms, because there is some variability out there in terms of how people use certain terms. And then there are some acronyms that I'm going to use. I really try to keep those to a minimum, but it just does become kind of handy. And so when we're talking about Lyme disease, it's as I'll talk about, it's a bacterial infection. And so I'll often refer to Lyme infection as Lyme bacteria or just Lyme. The bacterium that causes Lyme disease, often it's just referred to as Borrelia. There are actually multiple species, as we'll see, that can cause Lyme disease. Borrelia burgdorferi is probably the species that most people have heard of, certainly in North America, that causes Lyme. Tonight's presentation about the book, it's not just about Lyme disease. As I say, it's about other tick-borne diseases, or TBDs, as you'll probably hear me say. And I'll talk a little bit about co-infections towards the end of the presentation. You'll also hear me talk about the antibiotic that's most commonly prescribed for treating Lyme disease, and that's doxycycline, and often people just refer to it as doxy. A couple of other quick things. I'm going to talk about some of the treatment guidelines that are used to guide the treatment of Lyme disease and other borne illnesses in North America. And those two sets of guidelines, they're quite I guess kind of I want to say contradictory. They have different perspectives. One set of guidelines, which is what Canada follows, is the IDSA guidelines, the Infectious Disease Society of America. But the other guidelines that others follow are called IADS, and it's a set of guidelines created by the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society. And then the last term I just want to kind of introduce folks to that you'll hear me use is talking about a Lyme literate doctor. And so when I refer to that, it's a medical doctor, but it's a medical doctor who specializes in Lyme disease. So not your general practitioner, not an emergency room doctor, but a doctor who is a specialist on treating Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. And those doctors generally follow the ILADS guidelines. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, this doesn't make sense, but as we go through the presentation, you'll start to understand what that means. So I just wanted to kind of pave the road for that. So in terms of my own journey with Lyme disease, for me, it really started in the end of April of 2019. As Lauralee was saying, I live on 15 forested acres between Perth and Westport. So I'm on that beautiful Frontenac Arch, that finger of Canadian Shield country that comes down this way. Beautiful forest. Unfortunately, as you will find out, it's wonderful habitat for ticks. So I woke up one morning and found that I had a fully engorged tick stuck to my back where I couldn't get to it. It was about the size, a little bit smaller than a pea. So it had actually been on me for quite a while, probably a week or more. It was a rather kind of alarming and disturbing thing to find. And so I ended up going to the Perth hospital to have it removed, which they kindly did. They gave me 1 dose of antibiotics, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, the prophylactic dosage, and then sent me home. And I asked to have the tick tested to see if it was positive for Lyme disease. And they said, we can't test it. And I said, well, sure you can. They said, no, we can't. Unfortunately, that's a very common answer from the doctor's office, or especially an emergency room. And the answer is, yes, you can test it. The problem is that they choose not to. I think it just becomes too expensive for public health to do it. I'm not, sure if that's the only reluctance to do it, but the information that you can get by actually testing a tick to see what kind of microbes it carries, as I'll talk about later, is extremely important. And it's really, frankly, kind of disturbing that that hospitals won't send the tick away for testing, because it gives us really important information. So it took me about 7 weeks to get an official diagnosis of Lyme disease, and I won't go into the details. I talk about this in the book, but it was a real battle to get that diagnosis. I want to make it really clear that I have an excellent family physician. I really admire her, really respect her. She's an extremely brilliant woman and has been, helpful to me. But as you'll kind of learn as I go through the presentation, the medical system, the public health system in Canada is not friendly to those of us with Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. And I just kind of want to say too, as I go through the presentation, sort of explain certain things, you'll hear me level some criticisms of our public healthcare system. And I just want to make it really clear that I don't do that from a place of malice or, malicious intent. My motivation and, my purpose is really just to dispel the myths about Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses, to make sure that people understand the truth about it. Which unfortunately the information that we get from public health, most of our doctors, is not up to date. It is so outdated that it's basically wrong. And as I say, I don't say that with any, maliciousness. It's just that when we use information that's not up to date, it can put us at risk because we're not handling a situation the way that we should based on our current knowledge. Anyway, so I really had to kind of battle for the antibiotics. I got 3 weeks of antibiotics, and I went back and I advocated for myself, and that'll be a big message through this presentation, is about self-advocating. Managed to get an extra 3 weeks of antibiotics, and felt better while I was on the 6 weeks of doxycycline than I had in years, actually. As I said, I'm not going to go into details, but I might talk a little bit about this when we talk about chronic Lyme disease, is that it turns out that I've actually had Lyme disease, an active infection of Lyme disease, for several years. And I probably was infected with Lyme bacteria 30 or 40 years ago, especially based on my lifestyle and basically spending my entire childhood outside. And some people say, well, how is that possible? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. When the doxycycline finished, I became far more ill than I was when I started, which is pretty bad because I was really, really sick. 3 days after my tick bite in April 2019, I became quite ill. And as I say, I got a little bit better on the doxycycline, and then just really went downhill after that, and ended up in the ER a couple of times and really suffered. Sadly, that experience was my introduction to how those of us with especially chronic Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses are essentially abandoned by our publicly funded healthcare system. You won't get more than 6 weeks of antibiotics from a doctor, from a physician in Canada. And it's really unfortunate because it's mostly politics that's behind that. It's not to say, that there aren't great doctors out there that have an excellent GP. It's just kind of the way that the system is currently built and operating right now. So I ended up going to a private clinic in Toronto to receive treatment from a Lyme literate medical doctor, as well as his team. And so far I have paid close to $30,000 for diagnosis and treatment out of pocket. None of that is covered by the medical system, or even by the private medical insurance that I have associated with my employer. Sadly, this is a very, very common story. There are far too many cases of people who have had to either get a second mortgage on their house or sell their house in order to pay for their Lyme treatment. And often they're having to go to the US for treatment. Anyways, that's all I'll say kind of about my personal story, but I'll kind of weave little bits and pieces as I'm going through the presentation. So what is Lyme disease, and what do we need to know about ticks? I think, because I really want to emphasize, I think the most important, two important messages here. One is the most important thing I think that we can do for ourselves to try to reduce the chance of a tick bite and to deal with Lyme disease is to educate ourselves. So to get the current information out there, the accurate information that's based on the current science that's out there. And so I just wanted to go through some of the basics so that people have kind of a general understanding about what is Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is a bacterial infection, and it's caused generally by the bacterium Borrelia burgdorferi. And that's probably the name that most people will hear, as I'll talk about a little bit later. There are actually other species of Borrelia bacteria that cause Lyme disease or other Lyme-like illnesses. It's transmitted by ticks, the good old deer tick or black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis. So when you hear deer tick or black-legged tick, they're the same species, they're the same things, just two different kind of common names for the same species. And so that's the tick that is probably the most common one around here. There are dog ticks and other things as well, but it's the main one that we really see around here that's kind of moved into our area over the past several years, and the one that's mainly responsible for transmitting Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. Interestingly, out on the West Coast, as you'll see, Ixodes pacificus is the species that they have out there that is also a carrier of Lyme disease. Interestingly, Lyme disease is not new. The actual microbe's been around for, scientists figure probably 20 to 30 million years old, and it's actually been isolated from, I think, invertebrates that were that were captured in amber. So for a long time. And in terms of their interaction with humans, I won't go into the details. I talk about this in the book, but one of the mummies that was found from the Alps in Italy, that I think is, if I remember correctly, I want to say about 5,600 years old. DNA testing actually revealed that that particular mummy was carrying Borrelia burgdorferi. So it's been interacting with humans for a long, long time. The main host, though, is not necessarily humans. It sort of didn't really evolve that way. The main sort of tick host and how how the Borrelia bacteria is transferred is on mice. So white-footed mice is one of the white-footed mouse is one of the main hosts for the tick around here, right? Our black-legged tick. But other small mammals, squirrels, chipmunks, that sort of thing. The adult ticks tend to hang out more on deer, but another important thing to know too is that ticks can also latch onto birds, and they actually get transported around through migratory birds. And interestingly, not an issue around here, but in some parts of the world, ticks actually also live off of reptiles like lizards and turtles and things like that. So rather interesting. So there's the basic of Lyme disease and ticks. As I was saying, Borrelia burgdorferi is the name that most people think of when they think of Lyme disease, but there are other species of Borrelia that can cause illness. So Borrelia mayoni. There's also Borrelia miyamotoi, which causes something called relapsing fever. But as I mentioned before, unfortunately, our black-legged ticks carry other microbes, other disease-causing microbes. And a lot of people don't realize that even the ticks around here, like the ticks in my own backyard, carry a lot of these things. So we are at risk not just of Lyme disease, but of other illnesses. And one of them is called babesiosis. It's caused by a protozoan parasite called Babesia, and it's essentially a malaria-like parasite. So it actually burrows into your red blood cells, and a lot of the symptoms overlap with malaria. And actually the treatment for babesiosis is an anti-malaria medication. So I was on anti-malaria medication for about 8 months because of Babesia. Another common one that is around here that people will get is Bartonellosis. So the bacterium Bartonella, a lot of people know it as cat scratch disease. Again, that's one that you can get around here. Anaplasmosis is another bacterial infection, and one that I wasn't sure if it was actually in the ticks around here until my next door neighbor's puppy almost died of anaplasma. So we know it's here, unfortunately. Ehrlichiosis is another disease that is carried by ticks, and also kind of a form of encephalitis caused by a microbe carried by ticks. This is just a partial list. There are other diseases that are caused by other kinds of ticks, and thankfully, some of the other ones we don't have around here. When I was actually tested by the Lyme literate doctor in 2019, fall of 2019, I tested positive for something called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. To my knowledge, that doesn't exist around here, but it is probably one of the most dangerous tick-borne illnesses in North America. And I most likely picked it up when I was a PhD student in the southern Midwest of the United States. Luckily, I do not have an active infection of that because it can be really, really dangerous. But yeah, there are a lot of, very sort of tick-borne illnesses. And this is just a map showing the distribution of the black-legged tick in Canada, the United States. So that tick, the deer tick that carries Lyme disease and these other microbes. And so you can see on the right-hand side in red, sort of Eastern North America is a distribution of the black-legged tick or the deer tick. Ixodes scapularis, and then in gold, sort of on the left-hand side, is the Pacific version. So Ixodes pacificus, the tick that exists out west. And as you'll see, it's up to British Columbia and pretty much all over Vancouver Island as well. The black arrows show how the range of the black-legged tick is expanding, how it's moving northward, and the kind of frightening thing is that there's some science that suggests that the range of these ticks is expanding by about 25 kilometers per year. So these things are really moving quickly, and which means the Lyme disease goes with them also moves quickly. just to kind of give you a bit of perspective on how things have changed. So, for myself, I've lived out here for 12 years. I've never seen a tick out here, and I spend, as a biologist and a wildlife photographer, et cetera, I spend, most of my time outside and hiking around the forest and gardening and that sort of thing. I hadn't seen a tick in my backyard until 6 years ago. And then all of a sudden it was almost like somebody had airdropped, an entire, sort of container of, a million ticks in my backyard. And a lot of people make that comment, it's really kind of crazy. And so if you look at the top map here, this approximates the distribution of the black-legged tick in 1996. But if you look at the map on the bottom, that's 2020. And especially if you look at the upper Midwest, the Northeast and the Southeast, you can see how much red we've gained in terms of the distribution of the black-legged tick, and therefore, the potential to pick up Lyme disease. So it's a huge issue. So then is ticks live? How do we avoid these things? And one of them is to know where ticks live and how to deal with it. A really important point is that ticks need humidity, so they don't like hot and dry. They don't mind hot and humid, so ticks are really abundant in the tropics. But around here, they need humidity, and so they kind of one of the most common places we find them is in the dead leaves on the ground, what we call leaf litter. So when you're hiking through the forest, that's why there's a high likelihood of picking up a tick is because you're walking through the habitat where they exist. You'll also find them in tall grass, in shrubby areas as well. So those are kind of the main habitats. And as I say, we tend to find them in those kind of moist, humid areas. In terms of how ticks get onto us, they have a behavior that's called questing. And so what a tick will do, for example, is it'll crawl up the top of a blade of grass or maybe a small shrub or something like that. And it'll sit on the very end of say a leaf or that piece of grass, and it'll wave its front legs. It's called questing. And what it's doing is it's just waiting for a mammal to walk by and to latch onto it. And then as soon as it latches onto the animal, it'll walk, along that animal, whether it's us or a raccoon or a deer or whatever, and find a place to basically sort of plug in and start feeding. So basically they're waiting for a host to walk by so that they can have a blood meal. A point that's really important to make is that, we think about our habitat out here, about our beautiful forests and, our nice meadows and stuff, and that's where these ticks hang out. But you can also pick up ticks from your front lawn or your back lawn in the city. Because ticks are carried by migratory birds and by, small mammals and things, just because you live in the city doesn't mean that you don't have ticks or that it's not a risk. And so we'll talk about how to prevent a tick bite. So what I talk about isn't just for those of us who live out here, it's for people in the city as well. The density of ticks is probably lower than it is out here, but just because you live in a city doesn't mean you're not going to encounter a tick. So as I said, let's move around by hopping, by climbing onto small mammals, chipmunks, mice, squirrels, that sort of thing. We'll commonly see them on birds. We see them on deer. Often people will see them on the ears of deer and often see multiple ticks. I mean, it can be, pretty awful looking actually. The ticks that tend to latch onto deer tend to be the adult ticks because they need more blood. So, for them to get there. So as I mentioned, ticks will also be carried by birds, migratory birds. And I've heard people say, well, in that case, I'm going to stop feeding the birds. I'm going to put my bird feeder away because I don't want ticks. And my recommendation is don't stop feeding the birds. I mean, a lot of us really enjoy it. Frankly, our migratory birds, especially this time of year, really need the food. Humans have had a lot of negative impact on songbird populations. So let's not stop helping them. One of the things that I've done to try to, reduce the risk of a tick bite is instead of having my feeders in my backyard, which is where me and my dogs hang out most of the time, I've moved my feeders to the front of the house, where I don't spend much time. So it means that I'm not walking through that area. And so it's a really, really great way to still enjoy feeding our birds, but at the same time, try to reduce the risk of a tick bite. As I mentioned, because ticks live in the dead leaves and the leaf litter around our house, one of the best things you can do early in the spring is rake the dead leaves from around your house. This year, because we had a fairly early spring, I actually pretty much raked up my entire backyard, which is really large, before mid-April. I mean, there was still even a little bit of snow on the ground, but it's getting those dead leaves up from the areas around your house where you walk. You don't have to get rid of them all around the house, just the places where, say, you and your kids are likely to frequent, or your pets. And one of the things that I do mention too is don't bag those leaves and send them away. Don't think that, oh, okay, well, I'm going to take my leaves and ship them to the township compost heap, and by doing that, I'm going to get rid of the ticks. That's not how it works. There's always going to be ticks coming into our backyard from those chipmunks and squirrels, mice and things, and from the migratory birds. The other thing that's important for me as a biologist is in those dead leaves, there are a lot of other insects and invertebrates that depend on those to overwinter. And so if you rake up those leaves and you get rid of them, you actually get rid of all those really beneficial insects and things that are out there. So I just pile them in a corner of my backyard that the dogs and I don't hang around in. And that's just one of the ways that we keep ourselves away from the tick. How do we avoid ticks? What's the way that we can still get out there and enjoy our walks in the woods, or in the meadows and that sort of thing, and to stay as safe as possible? One of the most important things is to use repellent. And I grew up in Ottawa, and I grew up camping with my parents from about the age of 2. And I think most of us who have done that are very familiar with DEET, and not just the smell of it, but how it dissolves plastic and stuff. There are much better repellents out there, and one of the most important ones I think to use, and again, this is my personal experience, is something called Icaridin. I only learned about this a couple of years ago because of my battle with Lyme disease. So the active ingredient is called Icaridin. You'll also sometimes see it written as Picaridin. The great thing about Icaridin is that it is extremely safe. It's much, much safer than DEET. DEET is actually a neurotoxin. Probably not an issue for those of you who can't go to the cottage, but if you happen to be, say, a landscaper or a forester, or somebody who's out, whose job is to be outside every day, that isn't winter, and you're wearing DEET every day, it can actually have a toxic effect. Icaridin is much, much safer. You can use it on your kids according to the information that's out there. And the other benefit about Icaridin is that it actually lasts for 12 hours. If you actually spray DEET on yourself to keep the ticks away, as well as the mosquitoes and black flies that are coming out now, DEET only is effective against ticks for 4 hours. So you have to make sure to reapply it, otherwise you're not protecting yourselves from ticks. So what's really great is I spray Icaridin on myself. During the summertime, I'm spending time outside every day. So basically, I just spray it on my legs from the knee down first thing in the morning when I go outside to, say, have my coffee in the backyard. And if I'm gardening or just outside playing with the dogs or whatever, I'm protected for 12 hours. So if you're going to spend a day in the woods or whatever, a day at the cottage, get yourself a can of Icaridin. There's a bunch of different brands, and I don't, I'm not promoting a specific one. Just the one that I know the best is something called Pi Active, and you can buy it from places like Canadian Tire and Rona, and various places like that. So easily accessible. And what I do is I tend to spray from the knee down if I'm just kind of gardening or walking around the house or whatever. Ticks. The most common way for us to get ticks on us is that they latch onto our feet, onto our boots or our shoes or whatever, and they crawl up. So if you spray from the knee down and spray really thoroughly, you have a really good chance of keeping those ticks off of you. If you're going out for a walk in the woods, so if you're going to be kind of bushwhacking and you might be sort of bumping into brushy habitat, and trees and that sort of tree branches, then it's a good thing to kind of spray all over. As I say, the spray is really safe. You can use it on kids. There's actually a kids version, and I have friends who use that. And just by spraying all over, again, it just gives you that extra level of protection. Ticks do not jump, and they don't fall from trees. But if you have a questing tick that's crawled up a tree and it's sitting on a branch waiting for a potential host to walk by, that is how you can pick up a tick. So that's why it's great to spray all over if you're kind of out there walking through the bush. So what are kind of the main things that we can do to prevent Lyme disease and to prevent a tick bite? I think this is one of the most important messages I have, because this is something that's within our control. And I think, I really want to emphasize that I think what we really need to do is to institute new habits, daily habits. And I really want to emphasize daily. So number one is use an effective repellent. As I say, a keratin or picaridin, I think is one of the best and one of the safest out there. You can use DEET, as I say, it has limited effectiveness in the sense that it's only good for about 4 hours. Some people use a chemical called permethrin. It actually kills ticks, and it's very, very effective. I know the military uses it. The downside is that it is a pretty nasty chemical. You don't apply it to your skin, you apply it to your clothes. But it's extremely toxic to cats, and I have 2 cats, and I'm just not willing to risk it. And I just personally prefer to use a safer thing. So maybe if you're a landscaper or forester, and you're out there, or you work 5-1 or something, and you're out there every day, clearing brush or something, then you may want to consider, permethrin, spraying permethrin on your clothing. Just don't do it, inside if you have cats, and keep it away from your skin. Again, these are very personal choices, as I talk about in the book. It's up to all of us, I think, to educate ourselves about these things and to make our own informed decisions about what we're comfortable with. Do tick checks at least twice a day, from very early spring until the snow flies. And people say to me, well, why twice a day? Well, actually, for me, it's a minimum of twice a day, and often it's more than that. So I say twice a day, morning and night. So say you've been outside, having a barbecue in the backyard with family or friends or whatever. When you come in from the barbecue, do a tick check, because you could just be out there standing in the grass in your backyard and you can pick up a tick. So if you do a tick check before bed, the whole idea is to get that tick off you before it plugs in and starts feeding. And so the way to do that is to do a full body tick check and look for it. And then I say to folks, do a tick check when you first get up in the morning. And people say to me, well, why would I do that? I've been asleep all night, right? What, did ticks magically appear? The answer is no, of course not. But as I'll talk about, the little larvae and the nymphal ticks can be so tiny that they're almost impossible to spot. And so if you happen to have a nymph tick that had crawled onto you and it wasn't feeding and you didn't see it, you missed it during your nightly tick check, unfortunately, if that tick does start feeding, it's likely to be, it's going to engorge in blood, and it'll be bigger in the morning. And so if you missed it the night before, you should be able to spot it in the morning. And also talk about, shortly, you need any tick that's on you feeding, you need to get it off as soon as possible. So just get in the habit of doing a tick check every morning and every night. And the other thing that I do too is that, say if I've been out gardening in my backyard, as soon as I come in from gardening, I always do my tick check just before bed and then first thing when I get up in the morning. But if I've been out gardening or hiking or something, as soon as I come inside, I peel my clothes off and I do a tick check. I usually have a shower as well. But, if you did pick up a tick while you were out gardening, this way you'll catch it, rather than waiting 3 or 4 or 5 hours before you go to bed and giving that tick a chance to feed. So as soon as you come in from outdoors, do a tick check. The other really important tip number 3 here is when you come in from your outdoor activity is have a bath or a shower or soak in the lake or the hot tub or whatever. If a tick is not plugged into you actively feeding, if it's just crawling on you, and what happens is a tick will find you and it will crawl on you looking for the best place to plug in and start feeding off of you. Until that tick is actually plugged in and feeding, it's just walking on you, and they don't like water. So the best thing that you can do is, have a bath or a shower or whatever. And if there are ticks that are walking on you, as soon as the water hits them, they're gone. They'll pop off. So kind of my routine is, come in from gardening, peel off my clothes, do a really good thorough tick check. If you have your partner or spouse who can do the really thorough tick check, go for it. But I have a full length mirror in my bathroom. And, I do really, really careful tick checks. And while you're in the shower, the bath, or whatever, trying to wash off those ticks, take your clothes that you've been wearing while you're at gardening or whatever, and throw them in the dryer on high for at least 20 minutes. Don't just put them in your laundry hamper, because if you do, the ticks can crawl out and find you. So yeah, putting your clothes in the dryer for about 20 minutes on high is really good. And then the fifth thing that I think is a really important habit to get into is that if you have cats or dogs, be sure to treat them with a tick preventative. I'm not going to get into the details of that, and I would highly recommend people talk to their veterinarian about it, but you can get a tick bite from your pet. So in other words, your cat or dog was outside, they picked up a tick. My cats sleep with me. I think that's actually how I got my tick in 2019. I wasn't treating my cats at the time because they're indoor cats, but they do go onto my screened-in porch, and obviously they picked up a tick on the screened-in porch. So be sure to treat your animals, and not just to keep you safe, but to keep them safe as well. So doing those tick checks, as I say, morning and night, make sure to do your tick check everywhere. Check in your hair, your scalp, check behind your ears, under your arms, check your belly button. Yes, you can actually get tiny nymphs that can crawl into your belly button. Ticks really like tight spaces, so you tend to find them, like, for women, around your bra band, your underwear band, pants, belts, that kind of thing. Behind your knees, between your toes, the nether regions. Basically, there's places that you don't want to look at them. Check every inch of your body, because ticks, as you'll see, can be really, really small, and those small ones are hard to see, and you don't want to miss them. For kids, for some reason, ticks really seem to love behind their ears and in their scalp. So, those of your parents and you've got young kids, check them really, really carefully, and check, sort of look through their hair, because often that's where ticks will hang out, and make it a habit, make it a daily habit from basically, the time that the snow melts until the snow flies again. One thing that's important to mention, I can't remember if I mentioned it in another slide, is people say to me, okay, well, when winter hits, we're fine. That's not true. Ticks are actually active at about 3 degrees Celsius. So if we have a fairly mild winter day, if you go hiking out in the forest, or you take your dog for a walk in the forest, you can still pick up a tick. The other thing too is ticks will hang out, anywhere where it's kind of humid, and people have been known to bring ticks in when they brought their wood in for the wood stove in winter. The tick happens to come in on a piece of firewood, comes in your nice cozy warm house, warms up, and it walks off looking for you or your pet to hang on to. So you really need to be careful. So just to give you an idea of how small ticks can be, on the left is a picture of a poppy seed muffin. So you can see a couple of little poppy seeds with legs. Those are ticks. And then you can see poppy seeds. So you can see how incredibly tiny these ticks can be. They can look literally like a speck of pepper. And you can see this other diagram that shows the larvae and the nymphs and how tiny they can be. So it's really easy to mistake a very small tick for a freckle. And I've heard people say, oh, I found a freckle with legs. So, be really thorough when you're doing your tick check. Same with your pets, look at all the spots where they can hang out around your pets. And I tend to find them on my dog, mostly on their face and around their ears. So, I think it's really important to, to keep the ticks off us and to minimize the chance of getting Lyme disease or another tick-borne illnesses, as much as possible. But what if I'm bitten? Well, one of the things that your doctor or, your family physician or an ER doctor, public health folks are going to tell you is if you found a tick that's biting you, if it's been feeding off you for less than 24 hours, don't worry about it. That's an absolute myth. It's old, outdated information. And there's research that shows that there's the potential for Lyme disease to be transmitted in under an hour. So it's important that if you find a tick on you that's feeding, get it off as soon as possible. One of the best tools to do it are what I call the hockey stick. So these little green things in the photograph here, you can buy them at your vet clinic. You can buy them at pet stores. They're fantastic. They're a really, really good way of getting the tick off of you. Another myth is, oops, sorry, did I? Okay. Go. So some other science that I've discovered, you know, in the process of trying to figure out, you know, what's the risk of Lyme disease. So say, you know, public health will often tell you, if it's been on you for 24 hours or less, don't worry about it. And that's simply not true. And there's some interesting and frankly kind of frightening research out there that shows that ticks can engage in what's called partial feeding. We used to think that because ticks have basically, they hatch as an egg, they become a larva, they then transform from a larva to a nymph, and then a nymph to an adult. And the sort of conventional understanding used to be that, we used to think that ticks just need to feed once to go from one life stage to the next. So a larva will feed, and that's enough to transform into a nymph, and then the nymph will feed, and that's enough to transform into an adult. There's research out there that shows that ticks can engage in partial feeding. So in other words, they'll find a host, plug in, have a blood meal, but they're only going to feed partially. Then they'll drop off and they'll find a different host. And they may only feed part, you know, for a little while on that host, and they'll drop off and find a new one. So there's a lot of potential for a tick to feed multiple times, which we didn't know before. Some kind of sobering facts that science has learned about this is that ticks that engage in this partial feeding, they can actually transmit the Lyme bacteria faster during the bite. And you don't know if a tick has fed, you know, once or multiple times. So, you know, partially feeding increases the risk. Ticks that are actually carrying the Lyme bacteria, not every tick carries it, but around here, a lot of them do. Ticks that are carrying Lyme bacteria, they're less prone to dehydration, so they survive. There's higher survival rates. They also have higher fat stores. They're more cold tolerant, more likely to survive in the wintertime. They move faster and they climb higher, which means they're more successful at finding hosts like us. And they eat a larger blood meal, which means they're more likely to stay on you longer. So, you know, so unfortunately, ticks that carry Lyme bacteria are actually a lot better at infecting you because of certain changes in their biology because of the bacteria that they carry. In terms of getting the tick off, you said, you know, as soon as you find that tick, get it off you right away. The hockey sticks are the best way, I think, to get a tick off of you. You can certainly use a pair of tweezers or forceps. As is shown in this diagram, what's really important is if you're going to use a pair of tweezers to get that tick off you, grab it as close to the skin as possible. Because the last thing you want to do is grab it up a little too high and you know, you're going to have to yank really hard to get that tick out, because what ticks do is when they plug into you and they start feeding, they actually secrete a glue, which glues them in place in your skin. So they're actually really hard to pull off. If you don't grab that tick right down at skin level, you can pull the rest of the tick off and leave the head in you. And the problem with that is that the Lyme bacteria start off, they hang out in the gut of the tick, but as soon as the tick starts feeding, those bacteria move into the salivary glands of the tick, which is in the head. So if you have to leave the head in your skin, it can still transmit the bacteria to you, the Lyme bacteria, even though the rest of the tick is gone. So it's really important to get the whole thing out on the first go. So what if I'm bitten? What do you do if you are unfortunate to get a tick bite? A really big myth. Well, okay, you know, if you get Lyme disease, you get a bullseye rash. You know, we hear tons about the bullseye rash. Here's the frightening statistic, is that there's research that shows that the bullseye rash can appear in as few or in fewer than 10% of the cases of Lyme disease. So in the past several years, I know that I've been bitten probably at least 6 or 7 times, and only once have I ever seen a rash, and I have never had a bullseye. So the bullseye is actually a fairly rare thing. And you know, science is still learning more, but there's some data that suggests that the bullseye rash only occurs in certain strains of Lyme disease. So the certain strains of the bacteria. So here on the left is what the bullseye can look like. You know, you can see that, you know, red and then the red around it. So there's the bullseye. But if you look at the right-hand side, these are also Lyme rashes. And in the summer of 2015, I had what I thought was a spider bite, and it was just a solid red spot. And it turns out that was actually when I first got infected with Lyme, you know, several years ago. And then, of course, had the tick bite in 2019. when I had that fully engorged tick taken off my back at the hospital in Perth, there was zero rash at all, not even a solid red one. So you can still contract Lyme disease and not have a bullseye rash. And unfortunately, a lot of our doctors don't understand that. And unfortunately, I have also heard cases of a doctor where a patient went in with a bullseye rash and they said, you're fine. And they just sent them home, which means they've missed the opportunity to treat Lyme disease. So the other thing is, what if I'm bitten? Well, I took a vial to the hospital with me because I'm a biologist and I know enough to collect the thing. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go get it tested. And the hospital said, no, you can't get it tested. That's not true. And in the book, we've got information about where in the United States you can get it tested. There's also a place here in Ontario, there's a private lab called Genetics. So it's www.genetics.ca. And a wonderful fellow by the name of Justin runs it. For $50, you can get a tick tested for Lyme disease. And for $150, he'll test it for all of the potential co-infections. I've used his service before, and last fall, I actually pulled the tick off of the corner of my eye, sent it away for testing, and it was positive. So even if public health won't test it, you as a private citizen can have it tested. I would highly encourage you to do that if you have a tick on you or your child and you pull one off. That information is critical, because if that tick tests positive, then you can go back to your GP or any physician and say, look, this tick was carrying Lyme disease. And so I need to be treated. I need antibiotics. And so it's a really important piece of information. It's worth the money that way. So how about diagnosing Lyme disease? So we're kind of getting into the part where it's starting to get complicated and controversial, where we certainly we have incomplete science. I mean, we're learning a ton about Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses now and tick-borne diseases, but there's still a lot of things that we don't know. But again, the information that our physicians are taught when they're in med school is so outdated that it's completely inaccurate. So one of the most important messages for folks out there is that Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses, they must be diagnosed through a clinical diagnosis. And so what is a clinical diagnosis? It means looking at the suite of symptoms that you have and when did those symptoms occur and how long do they last? Because often with Lyme disease, symptoms come and go. A clinical diagnosis also looks at the patient's history. So are you the kind of person who spends a lot of time outdoors and therefore your risk, potentially is higher? Do you live in a Lyme hotspot like I do here? Or did you visit someplace where there are lots of ticks and a lot of Lyme disease? So they want to look at your risk of exposure, right? Did you visit a Lyme endemic area where there's a lot of Lyme disease there? And what's the prevalence of Lyme disease? I mean, there's an area, as I said, that was sampled by scientists not too far from where I live, and 80% of the ticks that they sampled were carrying Lyme disease. So that clinical diagnosis based on symptoms and the patient history is absolutely critical. The problem is that most doctors, most family physicians and ER doctors will rely on a blood test. And they shouldn't. It's absolutely, even Health Canada tells them not to do that. Health Canada has published information back in 2012 for physicians saying, do a clinical diagnosis. The tests are not very good. So, use a blood test as a supportive tool, but not as a diagnostic tool. And unfortunately, the exact opposite is happening. Doctors are relying almost exclusively, or many doctors are relying almost tests and not doing a clinical diagnosis. And that's leaving a lot of people really, really ill. So that clinical diagnosis is absolutely important. In terms of testing, as I say, the blood testing is only meant to be supportive. In Canada, like the US, uses something that we call two-tier testing for Lyme disease. So and the two-tier testing that we do in this country is looking for antibodies to the Lyme bacteria. So it's kind of like with COVID, right? When we get any sort of foreign thing into our body, our immune system mounts an attack to attack that invader and to kill it and get rid of the infection. So the two tests that are done as part of our two-tier testing, blood testing here in Canada, is testing for the presence of antibodies. And the testing goes like this. If you had a tick bite or you think you were bitten, another really important thing to know is that in roughly 50% of the cases of Lyme disease, the patient never even saw a tick on them. So just because you didn't see the tick doesn't mean you weren't bitten, right? So if you didn't find a tick but you have symptoms, go to the doctor. So the very first test that your doctor will do is something called an ELISA. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. It's in the book. But basically, this test is one that tests for the presence of antibodies to the Lyme bacteria. The problem with this test is that it really lacks sensitivity. And it does a really terrible job of picking up Lyme disease in most stages of Lyme disease. And I'll explain that in a minute. The second test in that two-tier testing is called the Western blot. And again, it's looking for antibodies, but it's a more sensitive test. The problem with the system is that your doctor will not do, or public health will not do, a Western blot unless the ELISA test is positive. And the ELISA test is the one that is not very effective. So the system's already flawed from the get-go. The other part that's really important to know is there's some really good research out there that has done a meta-analysis. So it's looked at a whole bunch of published science papers out there on this two-tier testing. And this meta-analysis showed that if you actually have Lyme disease, the probability that this two-tier test will actually pick it up is about 54%. So you might as well just toss a coin. The tests are not very accurate. They lack sensitivity, and they tend to pick up Lyme disease only in certain phases of Lyme disease. And what's really interesting, this isn't, there's obviously some variation here, but anecdotally, it seems like the people that are more likely to test positive are the ones who have a bullseye rash. So we have to be really cautious about relying on these things. I think, if there's one take-home message I want you to get from my presentation, if there's only one thing that you remember, it's this: a negative Lyme test does not mean you don't have Lyme disease. And that, I can't emphasize that enough, because I've been tested about 7 times for Lyme disease, and they have all come back negative. But trust me, I have Lyme disease, as well as 2 other tick-borne illnesses. So what if my test is negative? You go to your GP and they say, okay, we're going to do a test. And what they typically do is they do a blood test, right? They run that ELISA test. And if it comes back negative, your family physician is going to say, we're going to do a confirmatory test in 30 days. And we're going to retest with the ELISA test. And the reason they do that is that, remember, it's testing for the presence of antibodies. Well, if you've only just been bitten, your body may not have developed enough antibodies to be detected by the test. So if they test 30 days later, your body's had longer to develop those antibodies, and it's more likely to be able to, to detect them, right? The problem, it's completely flawed logic, because the problem with that is that if you're bitten by a tick-carrying Lyme disease and that Lyme bacteria is transmitted to you, you need to get on antibiotics within about 10 days of the bite. So if you're waiting 30 days to see if you test positive, you've missed the most important treatment window in the whole process. So there's a couple of reasons why your Lyme test might be negative. It's possible you don't have Lyme disease, right? You were bitten by a tick, but not every tick out there carries the Lyme bacteria. So maybe you don't have Lyme disease. But the other possibility is that you tested negative, but yes, you do have Lyme disease. And why is that? And this is a really important thing for people to self-educate, because as I'll talk about later, if you have Lyme disease, you have to become your own vocal self-advocate for treatment, because it's a real battle to get treatment in our healthcare system. Okay, so if I have Lyme disease, but my test is negative, why? That doesn't make sense. Well, remember, it's an antibody test. So if you don't have a very high level of antibodies, in your blood at that time, and we're using a very insensitive test to detect it, it's possible that you have Lyme disease and you have antibodies, but it's just not picking it up because there's not enough antibodies and the test is not very sensitive. But the other problem is that you can, and this is true in my case, is that you may have Lyme disease, but your body is no longer producing antibodies to the Lyme. And that's what's happened in my case. Is I've actually been tested at private labs and come back negative. And as my Lyme literate doctor has said, my body has stopped producing antibodies to the Lyme bacteria because I've had the Lyme for so long. And I won't go into the details of this. I talk a little bit about it in the book, but Lyme bacteria are pretty crafty. What happens is when they invade the body, there's proteins on the surface of the Lyme bacteria, and your immune system detects those proteins and goes, ooh, invader, attack, 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 right? And so it kills off you mount an immune response to kill it off. The Lyme bacteria has the ability to shuffle its own genes. And when it shuffles its own genes, it changes those surface genes. What happens is it cloaks itself in your immune system, because maybe your immune system is looking for protein A and is attacking the bacteria, but then the bacteria shuffles its gene to produce protein B on its surface, and your immune system doesn't recognize protein B. So basically the bacteria have an ability to hide or to cloak themselves from your immune system. So there are really good reasons why you can have a negative test, but still have Lyme disease. So, just to reiterate that, we really need to rely on that clinical diagnosis. And so we need our med school to do a much better job of preparing, our physicians for doing that clinical diagnosis. We need to get people away from relying on those really inadequate blood tests. So how do we do that clinical diagnosis? I'm just going to go through these really quickly. The details are in the book, but there's basically sort of three different stages of Lyme disease. There's early localized Lyme, which is kind of up to 4 weeks after the bite. There's early disseminated Lyme, which is about 1 to 4 months after the bite. And basically disseminated just means that the bacteria collect at the site of the tick bite, and they start to spread or disseminate through the body. And they disseminate further and further over time. And then the third stage is late disseminated Lyme, or often referred to as chronic Lyme, which the symptoms of chronic Lyme or disseminated Lyme can happen anywhere from about 4 months to even decades after a bite. Some of the symptoms, again, I'm just going to go through this really quickly because it's in the book, but in that first stage of Lyme, the early localized, you generally have flu-like symptoms. And, you might not be super sick, but you feel unwell. You've got fevers or chills, muscle joint pains and fatigue, headaches, sort of thing. Basically, you feel like you have the flu. And one of the important indicators is just what we call summer flu. We know our flu season here goes fall through winter. Well, if you end up with really severe flu-like symptoms in the summer, that's a pretty good indication that you may have Lyme disease and you need to go get it checked out. Again, the early disseminated, so the kind of that second stage of Lyme disease, the number of symptoms starts to increase. So you get, all of the things that you had before, but you can end up, one of the most important indicators of Lyme disease can be arthritis or migratory joint pain. You can get muscle, tendon, bone pain, shooting pains, nausea, dizziness, sore throat, swollen lymph glands, Bell's palsy, which is a partial paralysis of the face, one side of the face, heart palpitations. And again, don't forget that rash can appear in as few as 10% of the cases of Lyme disease. If you're unlucky enough to not have had your Lyme disease treated earlier, not know that you were bitten by a tick, and you end up in chronic Lyme, so that late disseminated Lyme, the list, all of the symptoms that I talked about before are there, and then the list continues to grow. And so these are just some of the other symptoms that you can have. Food sensitivities. I spontaneously developed food sensitivities to gluten and dairy. I'd never had them before, and I'd eaten that stuff all my life. But ended up with those things, and in retrospect now realize that it is related to Lyme disease. Just looking at the time, I'm just going to kind of buzz through the last little bits here. Long-term impacts of chronic Lyme. There's really kind of three main ways that Lyme disease affects us, and there's some evidence in the scientific literature that suggests that how Lyme affects you could actually be related to either the species of the Lyme bacteria or even the strain of Lyme bacteria. And something that's really important to know is that, especially for those of us with chronic Lyme, we most likely have been infected with multiple strains of Lyme, not just one. So that would mean that we would likely have more symptoms, and that the Lyme would affect us in different ways. But Lyme arthritis is probably one of the most common, and that's the one that I experienced. And I ended up with joint pain that was so bad I couldn't get out of bed. And I've always been an active person. I've never had problems. And how is it that you wake up one morning and you can't get out of bed because every joint in your body hurts when you, prior to that, were a pretty healthy person? So that's a huge indicator of the potential for Lyme disease, as well as the other tick-borne co-infections. there's something else called neuroborreliosis or neurological Lyme. So especially if you're in chronic Lyme, the Lyme can then create inflammation of the brain, and it causes things like brain fog, short-term memory issues, issues with concentration. My short-term memory is completely shot because of Lyme disease. And at one point I couldn't even read. So huge issues. It can also cause neuropsychiatric issues like anxiety, depression, and bouts of rage. Those are indicators of Lyme disease and other tick-borne infections. And finally, Lyme carditis, which is the rarest of the kind of long-term impacts of Lyme, but also the most dangerous because people can die from this. It causes heart block or impaired heart function. Generally, what it does is it interrupts the electrical conduction in the heart. So it can be really, really dangerous and something that thankfully is pretty rare. I just wanted to, a couple more to get through is just quickly talk about Lyme disease in kids. They're a little bit different. They tend to experience, it seems, at least just from the accounts that I've read in the literature and talking to people, that Lyme disease seems to kind of manifest itself more as intestinal issues, gut issues in kids, more so than adults. It can also cause significant behavioral issues in kids. And I'm going to talk just really, really briefly about something called PANS and PANDAS. There's evidence too, I just wanted to sort of throw this in here, to alert people. There's some evidence out there that Lyme can actually be transmitted during pregnancy from the mother to the fetus. Your physician is most likely to tell you that, no, that's not true. But as I talk about in the book, Google Sue Faber. She's an Ontario Lyme advocate who has done an enormous amount of research on this, looking, literature research, and there's certainly evidence of this happening. And finally, sadly, there's also evidence that Lyme disease can be sexually transmitted. There have been studies done where Lyme bacteria have been found in semen and in vaginal secretions. And there's anecdotal evidence of partners getting sick from Lyme disease. Again, we don't have all the science on this, but, to me, those are just sort of cautionary notes. I don't want to go into details here, but just for parents, the PANS and PANDAS. So PANS is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, has that for a mouthful. And PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disease associated with streptococcus. Basically, all of this means is that in kids, they can end up with severe neurological symptoms, and that it's caused by some sort of infection. And in the case of PANDAS, it's not just, in the case of PANS, it's not just, streptococcus. It could be Epstein-Barr virus. It could be Lyme infection. It could be mycoplasma. It's just that an infection causes some sort of immune reaction that manifests itself as neurological symptoms. And again, I'm not going to go through the details here, but one of the most common things that we hear about in kids with PANS and PANDAS, which is potentially, caused by Lyme disease, is that there's what we call acute onset, or just all of a sudden your child starts to behave differently. They're irritable, they're anxious, mood swings, outbursts, really uncharacteristic behavior. And there's a lot of research going on in the areas of PANS and PANDAS right now. So, I just wrap up by talking about, well, how do we diagnose Lyme disease? Like, what do we do then? If we don't have, these good Lyme tests to do. One of the most important things is if you think you have Lyme disease or you've been bitten by a tick, even if you don't think you have Lyme disease, but you've been bitten by a tick, as soon as you take that tick off you, start keeping a daily symptoms diary. Write down everything. Write down what symptoms showed up on what day, because symptoms come and go. And record the intensity of it. Was it really bad or was it mild, right? Take that diary to your doctor, to your family physician, and show it to them, because that's, for me, that's what convinced my doctor to give me antibiotics. There's also something called the Horowitz questionnaire. Horowitz is a Lyme doctor in the United States, and the barcode that I put up here is a barcode to his questionnaire. He's developed this multi-level questionnaire that asks you about the Lyme disease symptoms. And I think, if I remember correctly, if you calculate your total score, and if your score is over 46, basically it says you have enough symptoms to suggest that you most likely have Lyme disease. Well, at one point my score was 126. So I was really, really, really ill. It's a really good solid questionnaire. It has been vetted. And so it's a really good way to at least kind of get like an early warning system. Find a Lyme literate medical doctor. So a medical doctor who specializes in Lyme disease. Unfortunately, you will not find that person through public health, and you will have to pay out of pocket for that help. There's not a lot of Lyme literate doctors in Canada. A lot of folks in Ontario end up driving to the United States for treatment. If you can't get an LLMD, at least find a naturopath who is Lyme literate. And, you know, this is a big message that I tell everybody: learn as much as you can about Lyme and tick-borne diseases, because you need to become your own vocal advocate. I mean, I've had fights with doctors, and I'm not proud of it. It's not something that I like, but my life, my health is on the line. I mean, this disease has completely turned my whole life upside down. You know, I'm $30,000 in debt because of Lyme disease. It messes up your life in a really, really big way. And so you need to be able to challenge people and to really self-advocate. What to expect when you go to your family physician? Most likely they're going to tell you that you don't have Lyme disease, especially if your two-tier testing, if your ELISA test was negative. They're going to say you don't have Lyme disease, but we've already talked about how you can have Lyme disease and your test is negative. I was told, well, you know, you might have rheumatoid arthritis because of the migratory joint pain. Well, with rheumatoid, it's not migratory. It tends to stay in certain joints. But I said to my doctor, you can test me for anything that you want, but let's not forget about Lyme disease. And I tested negative for rheumatoid arthritis, even though I could barely get out of bed because of joint pain. Your GP will probably do a whole bunch of other tests looking at inflammatory markers and just ruling out other, you know, diseases and conditions. That's great. I think, you know, any doctor who's willing to test to rule things out, that's really, really good. You're lucky if you get 3 weeks of doxycycline. The maximum that you will get is 6 weeks from a doctor under public health, but they will not give you more than 6 weeks. And that was my experience. And very sadly, as I say, I don't say this with any maliciousness, but any doctor who gives you more than 6 weeks of antibiotics is at risk of losing their license to practice medicine in this country. Unfortunately, there are doctors out there who monitor how doctors treat their patients. And if they treat outside of the IDSA guidelines, which is what Canada uses, there is a doctor in Ottawa who had her license suspended and was under investigation because she was giving out more than 6 weeks of doxycycline or engaging in other forms of treatment. And the other thing too is that if you have late stage or chronic Lyme, if 6 weeks of doxycycline don't make you well, you're not going to get anything else from the public healthcare system. So in my case, I had doctors refuse to see me. They just said, no, go away. You don't, because doctors will tell you that chronic Lyme does not exist. In this country, chronic Lyme disease is not recognized as an official disease. And so they will not give you a diagnosis for something that they're taught in med school does not exist, even though those of us with chronic Lyme will tell you it is a very real disease. Just cognizant time, so I just want to really quickly. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I just really want to remind folks that if you're bitten by a tick around here, you very easily can have other infections. I got Babesia, the malaria-like microbe, the parasite, from a tick bite in my own backyard. And I was infected twice. So I was on anti-malaria for 8 months. Bartonella is transmitted by ticks, the anaplasma. I also have mold infections, and I ended up with mold infections years ago. I mention it here because a Lyme literate doctor will test you for mold infections because those mold infections severely suppress your immune system. And what often happens is Lyme and these other tick-borne illnesses often go hand in hand with mold infections. Because if the mold infection suppresses your immune system, it opens the door for the Lyme disease to then rear its ugly head and make you very ill. The presence of co-infections makes it much, much, much harder to treat Lyme disease and vice versa. So if you have Lyme plus co-infections, it's a really long, hard slog to get rid of it. And in fact, for people like myself who have probably been carrying Lyme bacteria for 30, 40 years, but have been sick for several years, There's indications, from doctors treating and also in the science literature that you may never get rid of the Lyme disease, that the goal is very much like cancer, where you want to get yourself into remission and then just manage flare-ups. And I want to say too that the testing for it's supposed to be co-infections, is pretty much as poor as for Lyme. So again, you have to rely on a clinical diagnosis. Last things, because I know we want to get into some questions and answers. So what can you do? Especially if you have chronic Lyme, you will not get help from our public healthcare system here. So what can you do? The most important thing is find a Lyme literate medical doctor. And unfortunately, this means it has to come from a private clinic in Canada, and there are very few of those. And I know a lot of people who drive to see doctors in upstate New York, where again, you're not only paying out of pocket, but you're also paying an American exchange rate. If you can't find a Lyme literate medical doctor, at least find a Lyme literate naturopath. They can't give you antibiotics, because a naturopath cannot give you dispense antibiotics. But as I'll talk about just in the last slide or two, they can give you naturopathic treatments, so herbal supplements, and those herbal supplements are very, very effective. Educate yourself. You need to make informed decisions. You can also test for Lyme and tick-borne diseases at private labs. I had my blood tested at Armin Labs in Germany. It cost me about $2,000 out of pocket. You can also send your blood to IGeneX in California. They're an excellent lab that does testing as well. Be willing to ask hard questions of your health professionals and challenge them. If they say to you, you don't have Lyme disease because your test was negative, go in there armed with the information that, yes, I could have Lyme disease, but still test negative. And here's why, because most doctors won't know that. And very sadly, be prepared to spend a lot of money to try to get your health back. And I think that's the tragedy here. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but again, you've heard me talk about IDSA, so the Infectious Disease Society of America. The Canadian healthcare system follows the IDSA guidelines. The IDSA guidelines do not recognize chronic Lyme disease as an official disease. Instead, a doctor will tell you to go see a psychiatrist because it's all in your head. Or they'll tell you that it's post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. That means that you did have Lyme disease, but the 6 weeks of antibiotics killed it. And it's basically a Lyme hangover that your body's experiencing, which is not true. The science shows us that that's not true, but that's still what our medical system believes. And you'll most likely, from a hospital, only get a single prophylactic dose of antibiotics, which in my opinion is very bad, because it's just enough antibiotic to prevent your body. It won't kill off the bacteria, but it'll prevent your body from mounting a sufficient immune response. So it'll basically ensure that you have a negative Lyme test. And finally, a doctor will only generally give you 10 to 20 days of antibiotics. The alternative guidelines, called the ILADS guidelines, so these were guidelines that were produced by a group of medical doctors who felt that the IDSA guidelines were not based on solid science. So this other group of doctors has internationally formed the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, and they say don't do the prophylactic dosage, get a minimum of 20 days of antibiotics, but you really should be on 4 to 6 weeks. They do recognize chronic Lyme, that it must be treated. You need to get the tick off you right now, and basically that do a clinical diagnosis. I've already really talked about this, so I'm not going to go into sort of how it manipulates your immune system. The 2 points I just want to make here that I think are really important is people need to realize that Lyme disease and these other tick-borne illnesses, they're very similar to COVID long haul in that they're an inflammatory syndrome. So what happens is when the bacteria or the other tick-borne illness infections, when they invade your body through a tick bite, they manipulate your immune system and they cause your immune system to create inflammation. So in the case of the Lyme arthritis, what happens is that the Lyme bacteria cause an immune reaction, and it causes inflammation in your joints. And that inflammation actually starts to basically digest your joints. It starts to break down your joints, the cartilage in your joints, because Lyme bacteria love collagen. And then the bacteria feed on the broken down tissues. So basically what the Lyme bacteria want to do is they want to keep you in a state of suppressed immune system and high systemic inflammation. So your treatment should be focused on boosting your immune system and trying to get rid of that systemic inflammation. And the last thing that I want to say here that's really important is when we're in chronic Lyme, Unfortunately, the Lyme bacteria can go into what's called the persister stage. And the Lyme bacteria normally look like a pigtail. They're called a spirochete, so they look like a corkscrew shape. Well, if you're taking antibiotics or, or whatever, if the bacteria kind of go, oh, okay, nasty antibiotics, I need to hide. So the Lyme bacteria can actually change shape. They can actually go from that pigtail shape to a round blob. And because the Lyme has that corkscrew shape, it literally actually burrows into your tissues. So what it means is that you end up with Lyme bacteria deep into your brain, your kidneys, your liver, your muscles, your joints, every tissue in your body. And when environmental conditions are harsh within the body, such as you received antibiotics, the Lyme bacteria will change into this round body form, which goes dormant. And those Lyme bacteria can stay dormant in your body for decades. But they can also then change back to the spirochete, to the curlicue stage, and become an active infection. So that's a really important piece of information. Just to talk about, finish off talking about the treatment. Again, I'm not going into the details of this because there are entire books written about this. I just want to tell people that both antibiotics and herbal supplements are the main treatment for Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. I have to admit, when I started my treatment, I was skeptical about the herbal supplements. I've been undergoing treatment continuously since November of 2019. And I can honestly tell you that the herbal supplements work, and they are actually the bulk of the treatment. That antibiotics should only be a periodic thing, like a short-term thing that most people get. In some cases, some people have to get longer doses of antibiotics. There's other drugs that you might need, antifungals. I also take CBD to manage pain and inflammation. I eat keto because it switches you to fat burning, and the bacteria actually feed on carbohydrates. So if you go into ketosis and you go on a keto diet, you're actually starving the bacteria. And keto is also thought to be a diet to reduce inflammation. The most important things you can do for your treatment: boost your immune system and reduce that systemic inflammation. Lyme disease also causes autoimmune issues. So I have 4 autoimmune diseases, and we now know that that's caused by Lyme disease. There are published protocols out there. Again, this is all in the book. There's the BUNA protocol, probably one of the most well-known and kind of longest tested. There's Dr. Marty Ross, Bill Rawls, others who have herbal protocols on what to take for what symptoms and when. The most important thing I can say is work with a trained professional who's Lyme literate, and your treatment is participatory. You need to be very vocal in saying what you think you need and what you don't need. So my last slide here, the key take-home message is prevention. I can't emphasize that enough. It's don't hide in your house. Yes, there are ticks out there, but I've talked about really effective ways to minimize the chance of a tick bite. Enjoy our beautiful outdoors and all that nature has to offer, but take the precautions, develop new habits. If you do get bitten by a tick, treat early. It took me 7 weeks to convince my doctor to give me doxycycline. It was too late at that point. Treat aggressively. Find a doctor who will give you that 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics. So basically treat you under those ILADS guidelines. No doctor funded under a public health system will treat you according to the ILADS guidelines. Self-advocate. I can't emphasize that enough, that you need to learn about Lyme disease and you need to fight for your treatment. So do your homework. And, the last thing, especially for those of us in chronic Lyme, it's a very, very long marathon. It's not a sprint. You're talking about years to get your health back for the most part. But you know what? I want to end on a hopeful note. People do get better. It takes time, it takes money, it takes determination, it takes a lot of self-education. But I have a good friend of mine out in BC who had Lyme, Babesia, and Bartonella, and she's healthy again. So you can do it. It just, I hate to say it, you cannot rely on our public healthcare system for it. But, I just want people to stay safe. And, I wrote the book to make this information easily understandable so that people can help themselves. So
Wow.
Sorry about a bit over there, but
it went so quick though. It was like so informative. Wow. And I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everybody right now.
I know it's a lot of information to take on board, but as I
Yeah.
say, you know, it's so important that we all understand Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses so that we can help ourselves or our
Well,
loved one who has it.
First of all, we want to say thank you, Dr. Ball, for all this amazing information. And just to remind everybody, because there is a lot of information, you can continue to watch this on our YouTube channel through Rideau Lakes Public Library. So that way you can revisit these slides and gather more information from this.